Welcome back, U.S. history. We're going to move quickly today. We left off yesterday with the ending of the Korean War, so it's 1953, and Truman was out. We have a new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, nicknamed Ike. Okay, Eisenhower will continue with the Cold War policies. He opposes communism. Basically, the Cold War will escalate. Um, Eisenhower's right-hand man was John Foster Dulles. Dulles was a very impassioned anti-communist. His biggest mission was to stop the spread of communism. Unfortunately, he guts the State Department. He fires and gets rid of people who he was convinced were communists themselves. Remember, we're in an area. Excuse me. We're in an era of Red Scare. Okay. And many of them happen to be Asian experts, okay, experts on Asia and the culture and politics of Asia. So when you get rid of them, you have nobody to guide you on policies there. We adopt a new strategy during the Cold War called massive retaliation. It's exactly what you think it would be. It is the threat of using nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union or China if there's any aggression out of them. In other words, if you threaten us, we will pound you into the sand. Okay. Ike stresses air power and nuclear weapons. You can see that we go from 1,200 nukes to 22,229 by the end of his presidency. It was enough to blow up the world 10 times over. A couple vocabulary words I have used. Brinkmanship goes with massive retaliation to not back down. And then, of course, the domino theory. Okay, the CIA really starts to step up and play a power role during the Cold War. Ike increases the use of this new government agency for disinformation projects. They trained foreign militaries in counter-revolution. There was assassination attempts, all sorts of things. The U.S. was not playing nice, and it will come back to bite us. Um, let's see here. The CIA helped to overthrow governments in Iran, 1953. Oh, gee, I wonder why they don't like us today. We overthrew Guatemala's government in 1958. A lot of the problems in Guatemala today are linked back to that. We had failed coup attempts in Indonesia and Cuba. Nukes continue to build up. We have the H bomb, which is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb by 1952. And just a year later, the Soviet Union gets an H bomb. So here you are, the arms race really heating up. And then we have the ICBM by 1957. That's Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. Now they don't have to be dropped from a plane, they can be shot from one continent to another. NASA's created in 1958 due to the Soviets launching the first ever satellite, Sputnik. You'll see it in the century. Moving on here. Ike's caution, despite his rhetoric, despite being a strong anti-communist, he does avoid confrontation. Fortunately, in other words, there were times where he could use war or violence or confront the Soviets, but he chooses not to, which is a good thing. He does increase the use of propaganda. That was the people-to-people campaign. Hungary 1956 is a test for the Soviet Union. They test Khrushchev's, that's their prime minister, Khrushchev's toleration. They denounced Stalin. You can see they collapsed statues of him, called for a peaceful coexistence. They tried to leave the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviets respond as you would imagine, and they come in with tanks and they crush the rebellion. The Hungarians were kind of assuming, based on the Truman Doctrine, that the U.S. would aid them, and Ike does not help them. The U-2 incident was a spy plane that was shot down over the Soviet Union. We're spying on them, they're spying on us. You'll see that in the century. Um, China is China figures out that they're going to need nukes as well, based on U.S. policy. Okay, again, this is using that massive retaliation. We hint that China, if you do this or you do that, we'll have to use nukes. So the Chinese say, well, we need one. And in 1964, The Chinese developed the A bomb. Okay, arms race continues. U.S. interest in the third world. Okay, post World War II, we have an era of decolonization. I mentioned it a second or two ago. Decolonization. All those areas that had been European colonies in Africa, in Asia, they are going to be granted their independence. That's essentially what decolonization is. The Europeans, the United States, are going to let go of their colonies. In 1960, there were 18 new African nations. Between the years, this 50 years, towards the end of World War II to 1994, 125 new countries are created. Most of them are non-white, non-industrial, and in the southern hemisphere. This is where the term third world comes from. Okay? And basically, in the height of the Cold War, the US is going to be looking for new allies, and the Soviet Union is going to be looking for who could be democratic, who could be communist allies, okay, trying to convert them. So the Soviet Union and the US is competing for all these new countries. Obviously, you would expect CIA operations going up. Oh, here's a map. This is showing you all that you can see the domino effect, all these new countries created in 1960 and whatnot. Many of the third world countries don't want anything to do with the US or the Soviet Union. They just need to get about their own business of becoming a country. Ike and Dulles reject being neutral. You can't. Remember, we're seeing things in a Cold War lens. It's us versus them. You're either with us or you're against us. A lot of nasty things went on there. Okay, racism and segregation as U.S. handicaps. It's very difficult for the United States during the Cold War to talk about how good democracy was and capitalism when we ourselves are not being democratic, when we have Jim Crow in the South, when we have segregation, when we treat African Americans as second class citizens. So the rest of the world sees the hypocrisy and the double standard. All right, this hurts our image abroad. So we're going to have to do a lot of campaigning, a lot of propaganda, a lot of aid to other countries. We're going to have to help them develop and modernize. Some U.S. interventions in Latin America. I mentioned earlier that the CIA toppled the government. It was a democratically elected government. Here we are preaching democracy, and we go to a country and interfere with their own democracy. Why? Because we didn't like the leader, Arbenz. He had messed, I've told you guys time and time again, when it comes to our business, our industry abroad, the United States will act according to money and protecting its interests. Okay, Arbenz was trying to get rid of United Fruit Company, kick out the U.S. and take back their property. So the CIA got rid of them. All right, and what does that do? That sends Guatemala. Well, if you're not with us, you're against us, right? So the U.S. wasn't their friend, so they go towards the Soviet Union. The result is a civil war created by the United States. Cuba, 1959, Fidel Castro fuels anti-Americanism and gets rid of Batista. Batista was a U.S. ally. He was like a U.S. puppet. Okay, and this was the Cuban Revolution. The CIA will go on to try and overthrow Fidel in the Bay of Pigs, and it will be a miserable failure. You'll see it in the century. Okay, the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is Palestine, what used to be Palestine. However, right after World War II, after the Holocaust, there is a lot of sympathy. There's a lot of sympathy for Jews. There's a lot of feelings and emotions. and what the Jews want is some homeland. Well, their homeland. This is a big can of worms to go over right now. You can research this on your own, but their homeland had been in Palestine. Okay, and so what the United Nations decided to do was to basically split Palestine and give part to the Jews and part to the Palestinians. Of course, the Palestinians are not happy by this. Some of them are displaced, etc., etc. Um, the United States is interested in the survival of Israel, okay, because the United States wants to be in the Middle East because it is rich in oil. So we needed allies there and we needed a source, reliable source of oil, okay? And it happened to be US companies producing half of the Middle East oil at this time. So it is intertwined, all right? And Israel today is still a huge ally of ours. Um, let's see here. Okay, other interventions in the Middle East. I mentioned at the beginning, the CIA helped to topple the Iranian government, again, democratically elected. Why? Because he wanted to nationalize foreign oil interests. In other words, he wanted to bring oil back under control of their own country, Iran. And the United States didn't like that because the United States had a bunch of companies in there. Egypt, Suez Crisis. Again, Dulles, John Foster Dulles, upset that Egypt declares being neutral in the Cold War. You had to either be with us or you weren't. Okay. There was the Suez, the Aswan Dam deal. Okay, you read about that. What you notice here is that when the U.S. takes these actions that upset other countries, we're actually doing ourselves a disservice because when we act poorly and in poor taste, what we do is we push these countries away from us. And if they are away from us, then they go to them. So there's a lot of poor decisions here. Eisenhower comes up with his own doctrine. It's called the Eisenhower Doctrine, 1957. It said the U.S. would intervene in the Middle East in any country threatened by communism. So it was like an extension of the Truman Doctrine, except the Truman Doctrine was in Europe, and the Eisenhower Doctrine will be here in the Middle East. Okay? And then lastly, we're getting ready for the Vietnam War to kick off in the next decade. Well, our involvement in the Vietnam War. This war had been going on since the World War II ended. Okay, by 1954, France was losing desperately in Vietnam. Vietnam was going to claim their independence. We wanted France as an ally, so the United States starts aiding France. If we are aiding France, then we are seen as the enemy by the Viet Minh. Let's see. 1954 Geneva Accords, their peace talks, was going to grant Vietnam independence, right? Part of the decolonization. So they split it at the 17th parallel, very similar to how Korea had been split. The only problem is the United States and the CIA intervene in 1956 and prevent the reunification elections because they knew Ho Chi Minh would win. We backed Diem to lead South Vietnam, and basically we're setting the stage for a civil war to develop. All right, the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, and eventually the Civil War will turn into a full-scale war, uh, a proxy war for the Cold War. All right, stop there.